It gets weird because you've got so many layers of fabric, so it starts to get super, super thick. The good news is your line of sewing is in the right place. You definitely changed that from when we did it yesterday, so I think you just want to roll that way and then press the crap out of that. You know, one of the things you're starting to see, thank you, that's particularly problematic with the continuous lap placket is that because you've got so many layers of fabric, that it really starts to get very, very spiny. It's almost like you've got the interfacing in there. So that's part of the reason we elected to eliminate the interfacing in here and go down to 3 inches instead of 4. But those edges are still really, really thick, aren't they? One of the things we may take a look at in the long run is either pounding them or weighting them to try and get them. You know, it's one of those funny instances where we start out with something that's 2-dimensional. It starts to become 3-dimensional as it takes on thickness. But we actually want it to behave like it's 2-dimensional in the end. And so the pounding may help us get there.
Oh.
So let's talk about sleeves next, shall we?
Yay.
In our funny evolution of this particular shirt, Brenda noted something the other day with sleeves, which is part of the reason I didn't really push for making sure that sleeves were cut today, so that we can talk about sleeves. So let me get a little piece of paper and something to draw on. Or something to draw with. So first of all, proportions for the sleeve. Let's revisit the patterning of the sleeve and how you determine the ultimate dimensions of that rectangle. Because we know that it's supposed to be, at least start out as a rectangle, right? So what were our dimensions? What determined the dimensions of this rectangle to begin with?
Nape to wrist.
Nape to wrist.
Minus.
Width of the armhole.
Width of the armhole is here. Armhole. And what is this length right here, Rasmeen?
It's nape to wrist minus width of the armhole.
Nape to wrist minus width of the armhole.
Oh, width, yeah.
Width of
the shoulder.
Of the shoulder.
Yeah.
Nape to wrist less shoulder.
Oh,
Right.
Less
Plus
shoulder
3.
of the sloper. Yeah.
You're exactly right. So it's probably like minus half shoulder. And really that plus 3 has more to do with the fact that I'm not sure ultimately from a design perspective what these are going to become than it does anything else. So you're supposed to start by drafting that particular rectangle, right? Now, one of the things we talked about was we did want to introduce some taper to it so that the wrist edge was narrower than the armhole edge. We did ultimately come to a conclusion about the proportioning here. What was it? How do we determine how much we're tapering?
2/3 or 3/4.
2/3. So this width ultimately should be 2/3 of this. So let's say for the sake of argument that this is 10 inches, then this one needs to be roughly, what's 2/3 of 10? 6.666666666666666.
So 10 5/8.
So it's something like that, yeah, 10 and 5/8, exactly. So it's gonna then become that, correct?
Yes.
Now, I want you to take a minute, yes ma'am?
I thought they were more gathered at the. My impression of the research was that they were gathered.
Well, that's actually one of the places that we are stuck at the moment.
Oh.
About whether it's coming into a cuff and whether it's gonna be gathered in the long run, or whether it's just fits more like a jacket and does this. So for what you guys are doing, there's no cuff. It's just gonna come down to a blunt end, so it's more kind of like a tunic-y kind of fit. So, your pattern is ultimately going to be shaped something like this, right? Now, I want you to dig into your little brain's eye and visualize. You go to cut this trapezoid or rhombus or whatever the heck it is out. you know, because it's a sleeve, you're then going to take this edge and stitch it to this edge. Exactly. Does anybody see a problem with when you go to stitch it together, what happens here and what happens here at these corners?
Ends up coming up not being even.
What do you mean not being even?
Well, one side's gonna be shorter once you put it on, or longer,
Keep going.
because of the armhole. One part is higher and the other part is lower. I don't know.
Don't think about the armhole yet. Just think about turning this into a tube.
Well,
Because you're on the, you can see it. You just can't quite describe what it is that you can
It's
see.
gonna be a square corner, but there's gonna be all this bulk. It's gonna be like a,
Well,
oh, okay.
more what I'm talking about is when you go to sew this to this and this to this, you're going to get points. You're going to get, your wrist edge is going to look something like this
right.
with the seam right there. Because these corners are now not 90-degree angles, and so they don't flow one into the next. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Just for clarity's sake, let's do this. Let's pretend that this piece of paper is our sleeve, right? Look at what happens when I sew these two guys, when I bring these two guys together. I get a little valley there instead of it being smoothly flowing across. And as Kristen noted, this point starts to be longer than this point does, doesn't it? That point comes to here, whereas this one starts to retreat up the arm a little bit. So what do we do? How do we deal with that? The question was, it's because we no longer have 90-degree angles here and here, right? So guess what we need to do?
Add some fabric.
Are we gonna add in the positive space we took out here, down here?
Not exactly, but you're on the right track. We're going to turn it into a 90-degree angle. So let's use this, again, as my example. If I turn this into a 90-degree angle relative to that line, it means that this needs to do something like that now, correct? Instead of being all the way down here, right? If I start to connect those two together, what do I get? I get some sort of very flat curve. The thing that I'm paying attention to is I need them to fluidly flow one into the other, right? So it's not like I can take this, turn it into a 90-degree angle, and then just do that.
They'll do the same.
Because those two would flow into each other, but then it wouldn't flow fluidly the rest of the way, would it? So that's why we end up with a very flat curve. And really all I'm doing is, in a way, as I'm looking at this 90-degree angle and seeing that it kind of projects out that way, and this one kind of projects out this way, and then I'm really just softening that point where they come together at the top. Does that make sense? Does that make sense, Connie?
Yeah, I think so.
Ish. So,
How do you determine that 90-degree angle?
how do you determine the 90-degree angle? Can I borrow your see-through ruler for a second? Yeah. It's totally easy, actually, because the 90-degree angle is totally based on this, isn't it? So all I've got to do is use my see-through ruler
Oh, okay.
and do like so.
Right. Okay.
So, Mary, what have I just done here? Because presumably now I'm going to chop this chunk of fabric, or this chunk of paper away on my pattern, so I'm losing this chunk of fabric. Take a look up here. Don't I have the exact same problem right here?
It's the opposite, though.
You're exactly right. It's the opposite. And so Mary is correct. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to add it onto the top like that. So whatever height whatever length we've lost right there from our original rectangle, we add right there. And then do the exact same thing. We still want to make sure that we've got a 90-degree angle there and a 90-degree angle there. It flows through this particular height, whatever we determined this is right here, and then we get some sort of curve that looks like that, right? Interesting, by going through this set of steps, What have we done, Rasmeen? Because there was one thing that was very frustrating for you on Monday. What have we essentially done?
Oh, for me, I was being fresh. We've added the real estate back onto the top. Is that
We have, but there was something else that Rasmeen was frustrated about on Monday, but other people were frustrated as well. Doesn't this start to make our sleeve look like our research again?
Oh, yeah.
You know, we had those two funny bits of opposing research where one looked completely rectangular, and then the other one had
Oh,
a
the
bit of an
angle,
angle here and a bit of a curve right there. And we said, well, it needs to be a rectangle. Well, here's the thing, it really can't be a true rectangle. And so now we've actually started to move back a little bit towards the original sleeve that you draped, haven't we? So it starts to look a little bit more like that sleeve sloper. Certainly not a ton, but a little.
Can I go back for a second? When we add in this positive space, are we taking this area and spreading it out between these points? Or are we kind of adding this shape up here and then smoothing into it?
You know, it's actually kind of neither of those and both at the same time. Let's pretend that this was the original top to our sleeve and not the folded edge, so I have some place to draw. We know we need to turn this into a 90-degree angle,
Yeah.
so that's gonna look something like that. We know we need to turn this into a 90-degree angle, so that's gonna look something like that. Because we started out with a rectangle, the distance here, and the distance here are all identical, right? And so one of the things that's gotten screwed up, because we put this on an angle, this became longer, didn't it? Because the shortest distance between any 2 points is a straight line. We moved those 2 points further away from one another when we angled it in, so it became slightly longer. We want to go back to the notion that the inseam of the sleeve is the same length as the outseam of the sleeve. So whatever we took away right here, on dead center, we're going to add right there. And then we're going to true it up. So it's not the exact same amount of real estate. You know, if we were to measure it in square inches, this one would definitely be slightly larger than this one would be. But in a way, my guess is if we were to measure it, they're gonna be so close, because you've taken this and then elongated it over this space, and so you've really only added in like that much. You haven't added in a ton. So in a way, the answer is yes to both questions and no to both questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, totally.
And so now we'll be able to stitch this into a tube, and we will have a fluid, continuous curve that runs across the inseam and runs across the armhole edge. Let's talk about sleeve assembly for a minute. How are you physically going to put these sleeves in? There is one element, one piece. I thought I just heard a dog barking, but it wasn't one of mine. Just startled me for a minute, confused me. Guinness, are you here? His spirit is floating around. No, bite your tongue. There is one piece of the sleeve that we've talked about at the very beginning of the process and we haven't talked about since. What is it?
Inseam?
Or is it this area?
You're doing
Oh,
this.
The balance point.
No.
You're on your right.
Is it cap?
The ease?
Nope.
The unease.
Is it the triangle that runs
here.
around?
It's
Gusset.
the gusset.
The gusset. The gusset.
Because if you remember, when we looked at your draping on the form, when you saw these 2 points come together right here, they pinched together.
Yeah.
And so that gusset is what helps create some depth. Because if you think about it, I want an L square. the thing that's funny about the sleeve that we're trying to address is that the sleeve has to transition from vertical to horizontal. So the sleeve can't just have, the armhole and the sleeve can't just have height to them, they also have to have depth to them. When there's no curve down there, they just have height, they don't have depth. So the introduction of the curve, or the gusset in this instance, allows the fabric to travel vertically and then laterally or horizontally or whatever you want to call it. I'm glad that's on videotape. Do you want the little hole now?
There's that, and then you taking off your pants.
There's all
We have
sorts
a
of
pretty
interesting things.
eclectic video collection now.
How does this fit in? The truth is,
Is it a square?
tell me if this makes sense to you. If you look at your research, what you discover is it actually is just a square. Nothing more than that. I want to show you a different piece of research. The cut of men's clothes from 1600 to 1900.
Oh, goody.
Isn't it very, very convenient that men's clothes evolve so slowly that 300 years can fit into this little tiny, tiny book?
That's so sad.
It is kind of sad, isn't it? But I want to show you, if you watch anything from like American Revolutionary portraiture to watching shows like Sleepy Hollow or The Musketeers on BBC, all the way through Master and Commander into the beginning of the 20th century, everybody's wearing the exact same shirt. Where the hell is that pattern? I worked with somebody once who, God love him, was kind of an idiot. He used to refer to this shirt that I'm talking about as a tear shirt. And the reason he referred to it as a tear shirt is because every piece is rectangular. And so all you had to do was clip and rip every single piece of it. Now, I would not recommend that because it fucks up the fabric. And they don't actually fit back together. Take a look at this shirt pattern right here. What's the date saved for this, Mary?
1700 to 1810.
1700 to 1810. Wow, same shirt
It's
for
like
110
90
years
years,
minimum.
yeah.
And it goes even further back than that. And what you can see here is almost the same thing. Here's the shirt front, that's center front, that's the side seam. Here's the shoulder seam. So it's a total rectangle. You can see here they have a little ruffle on the dead center front of the placket. Look at the shape of the sleeve. It's almost perfectly rectangular. It may have a wee bit of taper to it. What is this? What is this? And what is this?
Gussets.
They're all little tiny gussets. This one to be able to get the curve into the neckline, this one to be able to get the curve into the armhole, and this one to be able to allow the front and the back of the shirt to be able to exist over top of the hips, because the shirt would be split to about here without ripping quite so hard. So you can see, I like this illustration because you can see what they're actually doing is representing half of the gusset here, and half of the gusset here, and half of the gusset there. And so what you can see in this illustration is it means instead of getting a hard 90-degree angle here, you start to get a very clunky curve, don't you? So this is ultimately our goal. You can see, however, are they actually triangles that are cut? No, they're actually rectangles, and this is just a center line that we see in each of these parts of the illustration. So your sleeve will include a gusset. Your gusset should be a 2-inch square. Take a minute and look at the clothing that we are all wearing. You can see if you look at my clothing, if you Connie's is not a great example. Catherine's, maybe, maybe not. Yours is a perfect example. Take a look at Mary's armhole sewing. What you can see there is they made the body of the garment, they made the sleeve, and then they sewed the sleeve into the armhole, right? That is one way of installing a sleeve. There is a second way of installing a sleeve, which actually works very, very well for these kinds of very rectangular garments. I can, and this is part of the reason I said that you shouldn't have your side seams assembled yet, because you can, tell me if this drawing makes sense, so you have now sewn your front to your back. Here's your neckline, here's your placket. You have a rectangular or virtually rectangular shaped sleeve. You can next sew your sleeve from there to there and there to there, pretending that we don't have the gusset for a minute. Then you can just fold the whole thing in half and sew this directly to that, right? And this directly to that, right? So, so you're not actually sewing the sleeve to the garment all the way around the armhole, you're doing it in a slightly different order. If you take a look at Connie's shirt, for example, I'm betting Catherine's as well, possibly both of yours, I'm betting that they're assembled in this exact way. This is a faster factory method to be able to do, because it is so much faster to just do this one long kind of straight line than it is to do a circle into a circle. It's faster and easier to produce, and it requires far less technical knowledge.
Will we still have any ease with the sleeve with this method?
What a good question. Will you still have ease? Look at Alyssa's sleeve. Do you think it has ease in her teal sweater thing?
Yeah.
Like a little.
Take a look at Rasmin's. Can you see the ease there?
No.
I can.
Well, a little bit.
Because I can see it coming up and over like this.
Oh, here, yeah.
It will absolutely still have ease. You know, again, you don't have a ton of ease in this particular garment because it doesn't fit into a cap like that.
Sure.
It's a much squarer sleeve, but you still should have ease from there to there.
Will that come naturally with this, or should we add it?
Oh, Catherine, guess what happened? You started off with a straight line between point A and point B. You added a curve into it to be able to do all of this. What just happened to the length of the line that connects A to B?
It got longer.
It got longer, so guess what just naturally happened?
Ease.
It added ease in itself, so you don't have to do it.
How beautiful.
I'm so proud of our
How
little sleeve.
wonderful. Well, and this is, again, I did not anticipate when I put this project in the syllabus that any of this would happen, but I will always teach this shirt from here on out, because this evolution, the fact that Catherine just realized now it's put the ease in there, it's kind of cool to trace the whole thing through its steps, and now you can understand sort of how it happens and why it happens, instead of my just saying it happens.
Yeah. That's science.
So guess where you should be for Friday?
The whole shirt. Got the collar.
It is time to put to cut the sleeves and put the sleeves into the shirt. We haven't talked about gussets yet, so let's talk about gussets real quick. If this is your method, where you're going to stitch sleeve to garment and sleeve to garment, when do you install the gusset? How the hell does that work? The first thing that has to happen is you need to introduce a set of notches that aren't currently there. You need to measure down from here 2 inches and give yourself a notch. And you need to measure from here over 2 inches to give yourself a notch. And of course, that pair of notches is duplicated here, here, and here. What do those notches represent?
The edges of that little square.
The corners of the gusset. You're exactly right. And how many gussets are you cutting for your shirt?
2.
2. Why is it represented in 4 spots if you've only got 2 gussets?
It's got 4 sides.
Because you're gonna fold it.
Exactly, because you're going to fold it and it's going to have 4 sides. So it needs to be represented in all of those places. I will tell you, of all the stitching you're going to do on this project, the installation of this gusset is going to be the most difficult. Brenda, would you mind coming and weighing in on this conversation?
Fine.
What order would you assemble this in? Because I've gone back and forth a couple of times in my little noggin in the last 24 hours.
I would sew the undersleeve up to the gusset point.
So you would close the sleeve into,
And then do it all separately.
oh, interesting.
Because I find it hard to turn the corners.
Well, and see, that's the thing, is now with the introduction of this, you actually can't turn any corners. So Brenda's solution may be the best choice, where you actually stitch this to this first, and this to this. Then stitch your inseams together here. Then stitch sleeve to garment, and then last of all, install this.
The thing about it is the seam allowances need to be free.
Sure.
So you need to stop at all 4 points exactly. And we've tried this in the past where we've split the gusset.
Done it.
And
We've
had a
done it as
seam
2
down
triangles,
Oh.
and it's terrible.
Yeah,
It's
the
terrible.
same thing happens, then you have more seam allowance to deal with in these points. And so it's a little hard to figure out what's gone where
Yeah,
to
it's
stop.
gross.
So you have an even harder junction point actually.
Sure.
Because you've got an additional seam.
And does this have to be machine stitched? Is there a
Uh-huh.
no? There's no snippy way to hand stitch
You
it.
could start from this direction and do what I've told you. And then I would install here and here. Then I would flip the whole thing and go from there to there, there to there, there to there, there to there. You guys can decide whatever makes the most sense for you. And one of the things that we need to do is we need to pull a shirt out of stock that has one of these installed in it so you can see what it looks like at the end. Because as Brenda said, the real challenge here is the fact that with the exception of here and here, you're never stitching from cut edge to cut edge. You're always stitching to the notch and stopping so that you can then flip the seam allowance in the opposite direction, pick up at the notch, and go to that notch. Because you can't sew any of the seam allowance flat, it all has to be stitched open.
I have a
Once you
question.
see it in reality, you'll realize why the seam allowance can't go one way or another.
It's really annoying.
Oh, I
Yeah.
see, because, once you sew the inseam, then you press it open, right?
Correct.
And then you have the center, you can see the center point.
Yeah, the center point is back under there. It's like,
Oh, you have to like flip the seam allowance back on itself to open that.
Mhm.
Okay, okay.
So if you catch it down, then invariably you get drag lines because of the seam allowance being caught and not allowing the gusset to do what it needs to do.
the thing that's very interesting is now that we're talking about it, this is actually a very complicated version of the placket in the sense that you have to stitch exactly to these points and you have to get the seam allowance going in the right direction. Otherwise, you start to get drag. As a perfect example, one of the things we talked about is here at the base of your placket, if you're not exactly to that point, you start to get either little pleats or you get a hole. And this is a perfect example of all of that. It's really annoying, I'm not gonna lie to you.
So do the notches that we put match to the corner of the pattern line?
Correct.
Thank you.
And so that's the thing, is it matches to the corner of the pattern line, not to the edge of the seam allowance.
wouldn't be able to stitch it.
Why don't we just put the gusset in part of the pattern of the sleeve?
Well, as Brenda said, in some of them in the past, what we've actually done is we've turned this into a triangle. We've turned it into 4 pieces. So you could sew a triangle there, a triangle there, a triangle there,
Then
and
you have more seams.
a triangle there. And then you can actually pretty much just go again. The problem is you start to get a lot of drag there and there. And the other thing that I've found is feel your fabric. 2 layers versus 4 layers is very, very different. And when you get 4 layers right here in the armpit, the shirt just wants to do this. Like it never wants to collapse in on itself.
I think what Chris,
I know, I'm headed there. The other option that we've got is to actually, as Kristen I think was noting, is add this real estate onto the pattern. So instead of having your pattern shaped like this, why can't you just do this and shape your pattern like that? Because couldn't you do that?
Yeah.
You could. In terms of real estate, it's the exact same amount of real estate, isn't it? It's just configured slightly differently. I'm going to tell you 2 things. First of all, every time I've tried this, it really hasn't worked. And so that's the first reason that I would discourage it. Second of all, our research is really specific about the fact, even in the ones that are contemporary, that are still being sold, that's why I have that one piece of research where the guy's doing this, because it shows you that even today, they haven't changed the pattern. They're still, and so there's something about the specificity of having that there that I think is important for the specificity of the shirt itself. And because it's a pain in the ass, and because I'm a teacher and I'm supposed to make things hard. Not really. Because the truth is, this is not any easier. In fact, this is worse in my...
yeah, there's something, I don't know why, but it seems harder than.
Well, I mean, the thing that's weird is, because of this shape, tell me if this makes sense to you. When you go to add your seam allowance on over here,
Oh.
you still
Get a
have
drag.
that corner there and that corner there. And you go to press them open after they've been stitched. And because this is so much more constricted than that is, and it doesn't have to just go to there, it has to go all the way back to there when you press it open, right? Then you have to start to introduce clips into the whole thing, and the whole thing falls apart. Because these clips are at the biggest stress point of the entire piece of clothing. And they still, because it's a corner into a corner, even when you put those clips in, you still get drag back through here. It's the funniest thing, because it should work, but it doesn't actually.
I wonder if they would replace those gussets as people wore them over years
Possibly, probably.
as well.
Because when you think about it, if you look through any of our men's
Oh my
white
God.
dress shirts, all of this
Yeah.
is disgusting. It's yellow. It's not coming out
So
ever,
you just
no
like
matter how much
cut
you
that
wash
out
it.
and put new
So
fabric in.
that's a good. I had never thought of that, but it actually makes sense that if we could just get rid of that, we'd
Yeah.
have, acceptable shirts for equity
A lot of
actors.
people. So, there's a couple things I want you to keep in mind, because again, what are you supposed to have done at the beginning of class on Friday? You're supposed to have the entire thing assembled all the way through here.
Not the collar.
You're not worrying about collars. On Friday, we'll deal with collars, and then the last step is hems here and here. How many times for you, after having done this kind of project for 25 years, how many times do you have to stitch one of these to get it right?
Oh, a few, 4 to 6 maybe. Because you're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 junctions perfectly. So at least one of them is gonna be 4 times, and then the other one's gonna be perfect, and then one's gonna be like a couple.
If it takes Brenda that many times, how many times is it going to take you guys? Because it takes
70.
me about that much time as well. It's going to take a while. This is part of the reason we started off the class with me yelling you about not being done. Because this is a perfect example of why if today's work isn't done, then tomorrow's work just builds up on top of it, and after a certain point, you're just drowning. So keeping up is crucial.
So can I have tomorrow off?
How much time do you want in this room while Brenda and I are around to be able to give you pointers?
A lot.
As much as you possibly can. And so, of course, take tomorrow off. Spend the next hour sampling, getting through whatever you need to. Take full advantage of it. Because unfortunately, we discovered a couple of interesting things last night. Tell the room what you told me at the beginning of class.
Oh, none of us noticed until I got on it at like midnight that Dingo Boy was basically out of thread. So he ran out after like 6 inches. And I don't know how to thread an overlock machine other than clip and tie a knot. So I had to stop and go home.
Can I mention one thing? Because
Sure.
it had run out of thread previously. When you thread this, the biggest spool, the spool with the most thread, should be here and here, and then less and less. Do you know why? Can you think of why?
Oh, because, well, I know, because one is the looper, so it just
Right,
goes,
so
spins
there's
thread
way more
across.
thread going this way
Yeah.
than the ones going this way. So we want to keep the spools of thread sort of in the same amount so that we don't have 3 full ones and 1 empty one.
Well, it's also good for prediction as well when you go to, because you know what happens is, if you continue to put the emptier ones on the loopers, they're gonna run out way,
All the
way
time.
sooner. And you're constantly gonna run into this
And
problem.
like none of us saw it, so.
And the reason I mention this is because she had that problem. Catherine busted a needle. How many times did you busted needles before?
Never.
Never. So you had to incorporate the how much time does it take to learn to find a new needle, change it over. You know, for everybody, the first couple of times you break the needle, you go, "Oh my God, I broke the machine," and then you realize that it's really about like knocking a mirror off of your car instead of having a flat tire. You know, it's not a big deal, but for the first couple of times, it,
I feel like the flat tires are way worse. I feel like the mirror is a lot worse.
well, what I mean is that it's not completely incapacitated, but you have to go through it a couple of times. And so that's the other reason I want you guys to take advantage as much as possible of being here during the day. Because when those kinds of variables arise, which they do, you just can't predict. And you know that there are some days when it's like everything goes perfectly. And there are other days where it's like, I broke that machine, and then I broke that machine, and then I broke that machine, and I broke that
And
machine.
we come in the morning and it's like, what the hell happened? There's like one without a bobbin.
You know, and it's,
needle.
you know, I broke the machine. Can you come look at it? Oh, it's working fine for me. Well, it doesn't work for me again. You know, there's all that kind of Murphy's Law crap that you just can't predict. And so that's why the more of the stuff that you can at least sample through during the days when Brenda and I are available, the better. And right now, there's not a ton of people in the room. That will change in a couple of weeks. So it's easy to have space, it's easy to have our attention, it's easy to actually have a little bit of quiet time. So not happening in this room in a couple of weeks.
To Jesus Christ.
No, it's
And the
constant
current and costume tech, and you know, we're headed into intermediate projects for costume tech. You guys are gonna have to start spending more time in here because the projects are getting more room intensive, you know, so it